If you've ever felt like you're a completely different person depending on who you're with, professional at work, playful with friends, quieter with family, and you can't figure out which one is the real you, your brain is running a program most people don't even realize exists. And if that's ever made you feel fake, like there's something fundamentally wrong with you for not having one consistent self, that feeling is worth paying attention to. But the reason behind it is not what you think. Erving Goffman, one of the most cited sociologists in modern history, spent years studying how people behave in social settings and found something most people find genuinely uncomfortable: that all social interaction, even what we call being authentic, involves impression management. We are all, every one of us, performing. The question isn't whether you mask, it's which kind of masker you are. I've identified 3 types of social maskers, and one of them carries a psychological cost that most people never realize they're paying. By the end of this, you'll know which one you are, and more importantly, why. The standard advice for this feeling is some version of, just be yourself, find your authentic self, stop performing, drop the masks. And the advice makes sense. If you feel like you're performing, then stop performing. It's logical. But in 2022, psychologist Dr. Devon Price published research on neurodiverse masking, arguing that for autistic and neurodiverse people, operating in neurotypical environments carries a cognitive and emotional load far higher than it appears from the outside. And masking that load isn't a voluntary choice. It's a behavioral adaptation. And in many cases, it started so early, you don't remember learning it. Price was writing specifically about autistic and neurodiverse experience, where the cost of masking runs deepest. But the mechanism Price describes, masking as an involuntary adaptation born from environmental pressure, extends well beyond that context, as the research we'll look at shortly confirms. If you're neurodivergent, Price's book goes much deeper into your experience than this video can. It's worth the full read. The just be yourself advice isn't wrong. It's just aimed at the wrong level of the problem. So if masking isn't a choice, what determines the type of masker you are? I call this the 3 types of social maskers. Not because masking is a disorder, it's not, but because the type of masking determines the psychological cost. And that cost is different for each one. Some people adjust how they communicate depending on who's in the room. More formal with their boss, more relaxed with their closest friends, and they know they're doing it. They made a choice. They can flip back. That's adaptive masking, the most conscious version of this. You're code switching between professional language in a meeting and casual shorthand in a text to a friend. Same hour, same person, completely different mode. And you chose both. The most recognizable version. You walk out of a tense work meeting, call a close friend, and become a completely different version of yourself within 10 seconds, and feel entirely at home in both. This is what Goffman was describing. Social presentation is performance. Even what we call being real is a performance we've chosen to commit to. And for adaptive maskers, that switch is fully voluntary. Most people aren't here. But here's where it gets interesting. For a lot of people, probably most people watching this, the adjustment isn't a choice. You shift how you present yourself, and somewhere along the way you stopped being sure which version is actually yours. You're not performing to any particular audience. You've just lost the reference point. The real self isn't hiding, it's gone quiet. Here's what this looks like in practice. You're in a conversation and realize halfway through that you've been agreeing with the other person. Not because you thought through their points, but because your own opinions went quiet somewhere in the exchange. This is fragmented masking. And it's the most common one because it doesn't look like a problem from the outside. You're functional. You're adaptable. You just feel vaguely like an imposter in your own life. This is consistent with what the general population research on camouflaging shows, that masking becomes so automatic, the underlying behavior you're suppressing eventually recedes from awareness. You're not hiding anymore. The thing you were hiding has gone quiet. Now, the third type is the one nobody talks about. Some people didn't drift into masking. They learned to do it because they had to. In certain environments, families where emotional expression wasn't safe, social contexts where being too much had real consequences, the brain adapted by creating a stable, acceptable version of the self for each setting. Not because it was convenient, because the alternative was dangerous. The earliest version often looks like this: a child who learned to read the emotional weather in a room before deciding how to enter. An adult who still does it, automatically, before anyone has said a word. In practice, you're 6 minutes into a meeting, you haven't spoken yet, and you've already mapped who holds the authority in the room. Not as a strategy, but as a reflex you stopped noticing years ago. This is protective masking, and it's the type that carries the highest psychological cost, because it was never a choice. It was a response. That's exactly what a 2024 study confirmed, and crucially, it didn't study clinical populations. It studied the general public. Researchers I, Cunningham, and Lai, publishing in the International Journal of Social Psychiatry, found social camouflaging associated with depression, anxiety, burnout, and identity erosion. The people carrying the highest cognitive load? The ones who never got to choose whether to mask in the first place. You're probably already feeling it. Which one fits? If you read The Adaptive Masker and thought, "That's not quite me," you're right. It's the least common of the three. If the fragmented felt familiar, you're in the majority. And if the protective landed close to something you've never quite named, that's worth sitting with. The fastest way to tell? Ask yourself, when you're genuinely alone, no audience, no performance, do you know what you actually enjoy? What you actually believe? If yes, you're probably adaptive or fragmented. If you pause on that question, you might be protective. Keep in mind, this is a starting point, not a verdict. Most people recognize elements of more than one type in themselves, especially under pressure. And here's what I need to be clear about. No type is better or worse than any other. Being an adaptive masker doesn't make you more evolved. Being a protective masker doesn't make you damaged. These are different psychological histories, not different grades of person. The framework is for understanding, not ranking. Carl Jung called the social face we present to the world the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by theater actors. And here's what he understood that most self-help misses. The persona isn't the enemy of the self. Every persona has an author. The problem isn't the mask. The problem is forgetting you're the one who put it on. If you identified as a fragmented or protective masker, this probably didn't start last year. It started earlier, in the environments where you learned what was safe to show and what wasn't. The brain of a child is extraordinarily good at reading a room. If being loud got you punished, quiet became your default. If strong emotions made the adults around you uncomfortable, you learned to edit them. Not because you were weak, because your brain was doing exactly what a healthy brain does. It adapted. This isn't who you are. It's what you learned to do. And there's a difference. One is an identity. The other is a program. And unlike your identity, programs can be updated. So what do you actually do with this? Here's the practical application. These masker types aren't personality traits you're stuck with. They're behavioral adaptations that outlived their original purpose. And the first step with any adaptation is recognizing it's still running. The masking isn't the problem. The unconscious masking, the kind where you don't know you're doing it, that's where the cost shows up. The first tool, 3 questions. Do this when you're genuinely alone. No audience, no performance. First, what do I actually enjoy? Not what I enjoy talking about enjoying. Second, what do I actually believe? Not what I say I believe. Third, which version of me shows up when absolutely nothing is at stake? Your answers don't need to be profound. They just need to be yours. Second tool. Once a day, pick one interaction and notice, did I adjust something about how I came across? If yes, was that a choice or a reflex? You're not trying to stop either one. You're just building awareness of the difference. Adaptive masking is a skill. Reflexive masking is a habit. You can't upgrade a habit you can't see. One thing to watch for. Don't use this framework to judge the masker behaviors of people around you. The most common misuse of psychological frameworks is turning them into explanations for why other people are the problem. If you've done the work of recognizing your own type, that's the entire point. It stays internal. And that brings us to the most important question in this whole conversation. The 3 types of social maskers. The adaptive, conscious, chosen, lowest cost. The fragmented, automatic, the reference point has gone quiet. The protective, the deepest masking, carried the longest, the highest cost. You came in wondering why you feel like a different person depending on who you're with. Now you know. It's not inauthenticity. It's an adaptation. The question was never whether you mask. It's always been, do you know which version is actually yours? And if you've been calling this being fake, that's worth releasing. You weren't fake. You were adaptive. There's a difference. One is a flaw. The other is intelligence that got started before you had a choice. Which type are you? Drop it in the comments. Adaptive, fragmented, or protective? And tell me, have you ever actually found your baseline self? I'm curious about that second part. If this felt familiar, if any of these types landed close to home, there's a reason this particular pattern runs so deep. And it has a lot to do with why overthinking and identity tend to travel together. That's the next video. Subscribe so it finds you when it's ready.